Well, like any good Australian, I try to pay as little attention as possible to New Zealand. We, of course, only really care about New Zealand when they try and claim one of the celebrities that we've successfully stolen from them and they've gone big, and then we're like, hey, that's ours, and New Zealand goes, well, actually, they were born here, and we're like, technicalities, you stay out of it. However, there is something very interesting that's happening in New Zealand right now, and we did talk about it last week here on the Aussie Wire. The fact that of all of the Western democracies, New Zealand, well, the stakes are actually probably the highest out of any Western democracy when it comes to who their Prime Minister is, due to the way they're set up politically. Well, they just had their election, their general election for a new Prime Minister on Saturday. And joining me on the Aussie Wire to talk about it is Jonathan Kennerley from New Zealand. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we get on to politics, what is with this penchant that New Zealand has for claiming people born in New Zealand after we've successfully stolen them? It just seems very rude.
I mean, I asked the same of you. Australia's number one expertise isn't pinching the best of New Zealanders. And is it our fault? Is it your fault?
Look, moving on, before we start a trans-Tasman war. Look, you've just had your general election on Saturday, and I made the comment here on the Aussie Wire last week that a change in Prime Minister in New Zealand appears to me to be a particularly weighty matter because of the lack of a House of review. There is a single House Parliament. There is no Senate to hold a federal government back, and there are also no states. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you have a federal government and you have local councils, and that's kind of it. Can you give us a bit of an understanding of how it works over there?
You could look at it that way. You could almost also say that because we're smaller, the democracy is more direct.
Okay.
Because there are fewer layers. As much as MMP was introduced in 1996, and particularly for smaller parties, it is more beneficial. But you'll find smaller parties can perhaps get a disproportionate amount of control over the eventual coalition government.
Mm.
How it works is we have an electorate vote. So I'm in Auckland Central or in Epsom. You have an MP. MPs vying for each electoral vote. So that's alludes to the old first past the post system, which I think sort of you're more familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, you get a party vote, and that just contributes to the overall percentage that party is number of seats that it gets in Parliament. So we have 120 seats. If your party gets 50% of the party vote, they should get 60 seats.
Mm-hmm.
By and large, that is how it works. And then you think, well, where does the electoral votes come in? Essentially, should make no difference. Yeah. So the short version of it is it makes no difference. If you get 60% of the vote, you should get 60% of the seats. And you have a party list, from I guess 1 to 120,
Mm-hmm.
if you're optimistic enough. And when you get 50%, 60 of your MPs go in. Your electoral candidates will be in that list.
Right.
And if they're not in the top 60, then they will by default fall in that top 60, and poor old Mr. 60 gets turfed out. So you always get your percentage always goes in as according to the party vote, but that can be slightly, the actual people that go into Parliament, could be slightly different based on the electoral fallout. But by and large, not, because generally your electoral MPs are also high up on the party list.
Well, look, I thank you for that explanation. I am even more confused than I was before. So we're going to, once again, twice in one interview, we're going to move on before we start a trans-Tasman war, because I'm across politics and I do not understand what's going on there. Now, you have just had a general election. This was a pretty clear repudiation of the Labor Party. This was, of course, Jacinda Ardern's party. She was the queen of lockdowns. She was competing with Daniel Andrews in my former home state of Victoria to be the harshest and the most draconian. She famously talked about the government being your single source of truth. But she left before this election. Do you think that she saw the writing on the wall, or do you think that this result is because she wasn't there and that her cult of personality might have carried them more successfully?
No, she's pretty smart, pretty savvy. She knew the writing was on the wall. The country's been run into the dirt. Crime is all-time high. All-cause mortality is skyrocketing, but they managed to keep that relatively quiet. But as a result, the hospitals are overrun.
Mm.
The economy is just really rubbish. Inflation is high, and I mean, for those of us like yourself, myself, we all knew this had to happen. You don't get to, have your cake and eat it too. You
Mm.
lock down, you close the borders for a month, and then you're going to run your country into the ground.
Yeah.
So, she had it great. Their party did get about 50% of the vote in the last election, and now it's just bottomed out as everything we predicted would happen has come true. She knew it would too. I guess she probably knew, but politically speaking, she did all the right things.
Yeah.
And she got out on the high. Smart girl.
Yeah. Well, this is an old electoral map here of New Zealand. It doesn't shed any light on what you've just described. It still makes no sense to me whatsoever. But what I can understand is the fact that there's been a massive change. We've seen a sweeping change happen now. The Nationals, it will be Chris. Is it Loxon? I think it is. Will be the new
Luxon, yes.
Luxon. Thank you. Will be the new Prime Minister. But there is some questions around which parties he's going to have to negotiate with in order to actually form a coalition. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. So ever since 1996, when the MMP came through, it's almost always been the case that a coalition has been required. In fact, the previous election, 2020, Ardern got the 50%. She pretty much was able to govern by herself, but she involved the Greens anyway because the Greens essentially are the extreme version of Labour. And so similarly, on the other side, you see National, their extreme version is ACT. And they are, yes, the policies on the page are excellent, and cards on the table. I have consistently voted for them up until this election.
Oh, really?
So yeah, they've been great. Look, I've been involved in the past in the 2008 election. A personal friend standing, and I've got other friends who've been very involved, very high up, and very libertarian, or they were at least.
Right.
For those of us who are more attuned to genuine matters, such as freedom of autonomy and medical freedom and just not being locked down.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they came out. They now have a pretty good track record of being very authoritarian in that regard.
Right. That's unfortunate.
As I tell everyone, look, yes, definitely act. You have them run the country. It will be run incredibly efficiently, profitably. Everyone will be wealthier. But if we have another COVID situation or the next version of that, which might be, the digital currency, a financial
Climate
crash or something like that.
Maybe. Yeah.
The difference between a COVID national government versus a Labour Green government essentially is that because National and ACT are so much more competent and intelligent, they'll just lock you down even better than the previous government. They'll have us in the gulags far more efficiently than the previous government. The previous government, had terrible ideas and they implemented them even worse.
Yeah.
This National ACT, they're smart people, and unfortunately, things like whether or not what drugs and you decide to put in your body, when in certain scenarios, they'll be quite happy to make it very difficult to get out of that. So, great policies on paper.
Well, you're painting a bit of a grim picture. Now, I can remember not so long ago, to be honest, when New Zealand was actually thriving, your dollar reached parity with the Australian dollar. A lot of New Zealanders who had come to Australia because they thought there was more opportunity here actually started to head back home again, realising the grass wasn't actually greener and that New Zealand was really doing very, very well for itself. That, of course, has changed dramatically under the last couple of administrations of Labor government and Jacinda Ardern. As you said it yourself, the country's been run into the ground. Focusing on that economic side of things, putting aside the COVID response, etc., are you convinced that we're about to see New Zealand rebound? And to what degree? What could New Zealand become under better management?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, our resources and the people of New Zealand and the resources we have to hand, we've got no excuse. So yes, absolutely, with competent people and looking after the economy and just generally making more intelligent decisions, we are definitely going to rebound economically. So that's great. As in the meantime, I'm looking forward to that as long as I'm able to enjoy it.
Goodness, life is more complicated than we want it to be, isn't it? Well, Jonathan Kennerley, thank you so much for bringing us this report, this update on the New Zealand election. I'm going to keep an eye on how things go over the pond in New Zealand, because I think it's a wonderful little microcosm, a wonderful experiment in what can happen when you go from extreme anti-prosperity policies to what I hope we will see is some very pro-prosperity policies, and I'd love to see a really rapid turnaround. Jonathan Kennerley from New Zealand, thank you so much.
Thank you.